Hi everybody, my name's Jake Whidden and I work for Macmillan Education Asia as a regional trainer and consultant. Today's small talk is on skilling up students through reading and looking at a framework for extensive reading. I'm going to start with a little story. When I was teaching in Wuhan in China, this was my student, and she was really good at reading in class. She could do skimming, scanning, she could read for detail, she could find and answer comprehension questions, and she always did really well on her reading tests. Eventually, she took her IELTS exam and she got an 8.5 on reading. Then she went overseas, and I used to keep in contact with her. And one day I was writing to her and I said, "Tell me what you've been reading lately." And she said, "I don't read at all." And I said, "Why don't you read at all?" And she said, "I hate reading, I don't enjoy reading at all." And I was really surprised by this because in my mind, in class, she was so good at reading, yet out of class, she didn't want to read. And I thought this was really sad because we all know how great reading can be as a learning tool for our students. So I want you to keep that story in mind for this small talk. And we're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about skills and motivation for reading, an approach and a framework to reading outside of the class, and a few tips of what we can do in the class to get our students to read out of the class. But firstly, let's talk about you, and I'll talk about myself. Why do I read, and why do you read? When we read for knowledge. We read for inspiration. We read to stimulate our minds, and we read for pleasure. Sadly, what a lot of our students do is read to do a test. And at the end, they have to do this test, answer the questions, and I think that contributes to them being demotivated to want to read outside of the classroom. So how can we bring these positive benefits to reading and give them to our students so they can continue reading when they leave the classroom? We all know that reading is beneficial, but let's have a look at a few benefits to second language learners of why reading outside of the classroom is so useful to them. The first one is it exposes them to authentic English. Books are real, they're not made up. A textbook might be made up, but the texts in books are usually the same things that we might read in our countries. And even if they're children's books, they're the same basic things that we would read. Even a graded reader is just a copy of a natural text from a Western country, or sorry, a native-speaking country, and graded down so they can read that. But the point is that the language is authentic. Reading encourages creativity and critical thinking, which are two skills that you need to keep learning a language. The more creativity you have, the more you can solve problems. The more critical thinking, the more you can solve problems of language learning as well. And another one is that it subconsciously teaches grammar. When you're reading, it doesn't give you the grammar in sporadic moments or in sporadic lessons. It gives you the grammar in a natural context. It keeps repeating those grammar forms over and over and over again. So it gives so much exposure to that grammar, it hopefully will seep in to the mind and passively teach the students the grammar. So even if they're using spoken language and not saying or using the grammar correctly, by keeping on reading, it's providing a model that will hopefully then encourage their brains to remember what the real grammar is. Another one is that it combats this idea of drip feeding. If you can imagine a tap on just dripping bit by bit, that's how a lot of our students learn English. They come to a class once a week for 2 hours, and then they don't do any more English. And in a place like Asia, where there's not as much English in the streets, if you go to Japan or China, we don't see that much English around us. So having the books helps combat this idea of just dripping English in. It sort of turns the tap on for them. And my favorite one of all is that reading encourages learner autonomy. It encourages independent learning. And I guess the real skill of any teacher is teaching your students how to learn on their own so they can leave the classroom and keep on learning English. So that's some of the benefits of learning English. Let's look at some of the research. So some secondary research from many, many great people, but mainly the leading person in extensive reading is Stephen Krashen. Check out anything he talks about with reading. He's a very big advocate of extensive reading, which we'll define in a minute. But Stephen says, or Krashen says, sorry, free reading books leads to better comprehension, better writing skills, better acquisition of vocabulary, better spelling, and better grammar through that subconscious teaching. He also says that students who read out of class, and the research shows this, that they do better in tests of reading, writing, even listening. They do better on vocabulary and grammar, and importantly, even pronunciation. A little bit of research that we did recently in Asia, we were asking teachers, which language skills are you most confident in teaching? Which language skills are you most confident in teaching? As you can see here at the top, we have speaking, and down the bottom, we have writing skills. Now, which one do you think was the one that teachers said, I'm most confident in teaching? Well, at the top, they all said they're very confident in teaching speaking, vocabulary, and grammar. And reading skills was way down at the bottom. So this was not the thing that most teachers feel most confident about. Interestingly, when we researched MA teachers, Dip TESOL teachers, and Delta teachers, reading drops down even further to the bottom, down there with writing skills as well. This fascinates me, is why do teachers not feel confident teaching reading, and why are our students sometimes a bit opposed to wanting to read? So the idea is, how do we motivate our students to read when they leave the classroom? And what can we do in the classroom to build skills out of the classroom? I just did some really informal research just last week, actually, and we had 135 teachers. They were from Vietnam, China, Japan, Thailand, and we asked them, how important do you think, very important is 5, not very important, 1. How important do you think reading is for your students outside the classroom? And 70% of those teachers rated it as 5, very important to them. And when I asked the same teachers, how often are your students reading outside the classroom? 70% of them said they're either never reading outside the classroom or only once a month. So we have a bit of a contradiction there. Teachers think it's very important, but their students aren't doing it. So what's the issue with this? Well, this brings me way back to my student at the beginning. I said, why wasn't she reading outside the classroom? And I thought, is it my issue or is it her issue? And of course, at first, I blamed her. But then I realized that it's probably my issue, and what could I be doing differently to ensure that she was motivated to read outside the class? So think about this idea that we can give students the reading skills, but we've also got to give them the motivation. And when we think about the skills, don't just think about reading for gist, or skimming, or scanning, or identifying vocabulary. These are very important skills for reading, but they're only half the journey to reading. We also need to build skills to help them approach reading when they leave the classroom, and hopefully by doing these other skills, they'll be motivated to want to read once they leave the classroom. So let's talk about extensive reading, because this is really the framework of everything when we talk about reading outside the classroom. And I'm sure most of you have heard this statement, this idea before. But just to define it quickly for you, intensive reading is those things that we keep on mentioning. Reading for detail, reading for specific language, skimming, scanning, and answering comprehension questions. These are the things that teachers kind of do pretty well in classes at the moment. And having textbooks like Essential Reading, really help focus on those skills. And a book like that needs to be then taken outside the classroom. And this is what extensive reading is. Extensive reading is involving learners to read texts for pleasure, for inspiration, for knowledge. It's about reading in a relaxed environment. And it's about reading at a level that is comfortable to you, not pushing you to read something that is too difficult. You should actually try to read a little bit lower than your level. And it should be about something that you want to read. I'll give you some tips on that at the end of the video, so stay tuned. A little bit of history of extensive reading. It's not a new thing. This has been around since the 60s and 70s, but it's really starting to take it's getting a bit more momentum at the moment because we're understanding again how important reading is outside the classroom. There's reading programs from all over the world. These came about especially in countries, actually in poorer countries, less developed countries that needed access to English because they didn't have the resources. And books were an easier way to do that. We had things like the Fiji Book Club, the Singapore REAP program, the Sri Lanka Books in Schools. There was SSS, which was a big one in Japan, Start with Simple Stories, or some people call it Sustained Silent Reading. There was free uninterrupted reading, and DEAR, Drop Everything and Read. Check out the ones here if you want, and search a few of them because they're quite fascinating where they came from. So that's a little look at what and where extensive reading is and where it came from. But what can we do in the classroom? Let's have a look. Imagine your students are good at all those intensive reading skills, but we need a framework. I think a framework helps your students more once they leave the classroom. It's quite difficult in your second language to want to pick up a book, and how do I approach that book? How do I tackle it? Do I just pick it up and start reading? That's not how we do things. So I want you to think back to, what do you do when you pick up a book? What type of things do you do when you go to a bookshop? You don't just pick up books and start reading, you kind of go through a process. So this simple framework is something you can practice in class that will help them out of class. So let's have a look at it. It's context, prediction, then ask questions, then you can read, then discuss and share. You'll notice that the context, predictions and asking questions all happen before the reading. And these are the parts that really help motivate you to want to read the book. The parts after that are the parts that motivate you to want to talk about that book and share the book. So think about that on your own point of view, and we'll have a look at what we can do in the class. Let's look at it. So contexts are about setting the reason the students want to read this book, giving them, activating the schemata or activating previous knowledge that they might need about that book. Now, why would a student know how to do that if they'd never been taught how to do that? They probably know how to do it in their L1, but it's very difficult to start doing it in your L2. So in class, an idea is you just get a book like this one and you start thinking, what's this book about? What type of, giving them a context around the book. Here's one on the history of China. So before that class, we might bring in a little video on the history of China. Here's some pictures around the book that talk about the history of China. And you're just getting your class to start talking about it, and they're activating ideas. One small tip is let them speak in their L1. If it's in Thailand, let them speak in Thai, and they can start to think about that. Then ask them to speak in English. By setting the context and getting them to talk about what that book might be about, or the ideas around that book, you're letting them collaborate together, and it's also encouraging critical thinking. What type of things might come up? Which leads me to the next one. Let them start predicting. So this idea of prediction is, so in the same book, what's going to happen if I read this book? The last 100 years of Chinese history. What am I going to find out here? Well, I'm going to think, will they talk about 1949? Will they talk about the last dynasty? And who knows what will happen in the book? Maybe they won't talk about that, but you're letting your students predict, and then that's giving them a motivation to want to read. And by predicting, you're also developing critical thinking. And prediction is a huge skill when you're learning a language. When you don't know a new word, when you're in the street, you just have to guess that word sometimes. You guess from context around you what it might be. So just by approaching reading in this way, you're also developing other aspects for them to help with the rest of their language. Here comes the next one, and it might be a bit strange. And you can do this with kids' books. You can do this with adults' books. Getting your students to ask the book a question. Here's a cool kids reader. It's about the monster here. And the monster says, what we can ask our kids to do, you can do this with kids or adults, ask them a question like, what's the monster going to do? Or, if they're very low level, just, what is the monster doing? Or, what's the monster's name? Anything. If it's a higher level book, like our 100 Years of History, ask some questions. What was the difference between the last dynasty and the dynasty before? These might be things that they want to find out. But by asking the book questions, you're letting them take control of how they're going to approach that book. You're not telling them what to do. And that's a skill that they can start developing to do outside the classroom. But the key is that it motivates them to want to read that book. So now, you've done your reading, it's time to discuss. No tests, no comprehension questions, no teacher-led here. This is all student-led. And the easiest way to do this is just say, okay guys, discuss. Give them that confidence and that comfortable environment where they feel they can say anything. One technique I usually do here is I put on a little bit louder music, so it just sort of lowers the filters in the class that I don't feel nervous to now talk about it. And I just step back from them. I don't monitor, and I just let them go. And then they can start talking about it. And the first few times you try this, they might not do it. But reward their positive behavior. If you see them talking about it, don't comment on what they talk about. Comment on the behavior that they had. So if they talk to each other, say, that's great, guys, I saw you talking about the book. You don't have to say, well done, what was your opinion on the book? That's for the first few times. After a few weeks of doing this, you can start getting involved in the conversation as well and pushing them a bit further, asking them some higher reasoning questions, if you want to. The idea of this, though, is that the students lead the conversation, there's no wrong or right answers, and they get to choose what they're going to say. If we look at the book here again about the monster and the goats, the child might just say, I like the monster. That's okay, because they chose. They might say, the goat is strong, because he fought the monster in the story. He might just say, or she might just say, the monster is bad. That's okay, because it's them choosing. The last one is this idea of sharing. We do it naturally. When I finish a book, I talk about it with my friends. But the next thing someone says to me is, can you send me that book, please? Do you have the PDF, please? Can you give me the hard copy of that book, please? Because I want to use it myself. Or they can share ideas. Today's the world of social media. It shouldn't stop at a discussion in the classroom. So in the class, I often would encourage you to say, okay, now send a message to your friend on whatever social media platform you're using and tell them about the book. This is this idea of sharing beyond just having a discussion with each other. Let them share the books with each other. A really lovely idea is when get your class to write their name in the book, and when they've read it, then they pass it to their friend when they're finished. Or they don't have to finish the book. When they're finished using the book, pass it on to a friend. The next person writes their name in it. When you get the book, you might see that 5 of your friends have read this book before. And then you can go and talk about that with those friends. Oh, what did you think of this book? But this idea of sharing beyond the classroom. And you're giving them the idea that they can take on ownership of the book once they leave the classroom. And this is about peer learning. And if they're peer learning, they're going to learn more. They'll always learn more of each other than they'll learn of you as a teacher. Your job is just to provide a model to help them do that. So that's the model. Set a context, predict, ask questions, then read, then discuss, and then share. And by giving this in the classroom, hopefully you're motivating them to do this when they leave the classroom. But if they don't have those skills to do that, they can't be expected to keep reading when they leave the classroom. Remember, all these things that we're doing in this model, they're helping with collaboration. They're helping with critical thinking, they're helping with creativity, and they're helping with communication. These are the 4 C's of 21st century learning, and these are all beneficial to your student. Don't think of reading as just about reading. It should be developing many more aspects of the student's learning. Here are a few tips from me that will help you set up an extensive reading program in your school, but mainly motivate and encourage your students to want to read more. The first one is, just like I mentioned in the 5-finger test, was make easy material available to your students. Best way to do this is probably through graded readers. A series of graded readers, like the Macmillan series, an awesome way to get lots of different levels of reading into your school in an easy way. Also, though, encourage them to bring in their own books and start swapping them. Have a book club or something where they can start encouraging them. If you have 200 students, 200, that's 200, that's 200 books that you can have, and then they can start sharing. By having a variety of topics, you're allowing them to choose their own. And if they choose their own, that is the key to learner autonomy. choice is really the foundation of learner autonomy, and it will motivate them to want to read the book because they're allowed to choose. They'll want to talk about the books that they've chosen. They'll want to share with their friends. They'll want to collaborate. Another thing is try to provide space for them to read. And I know it's hard in a school that you won't have many places to do that, but I've seen some really great places that have little quiet rooms where they encourage the students to come in before class or stay after class and just spend an hour in that room reading, talking to other people about books, having the library in there, having some comfortable seats, having a sofa, having some cushions where they really feel like this isn't a subject at school. Reading, it's about inspiring you. Really nice places, maybe with pictures on the walls that are quite a calming place where you want to read. And the last one is, we all know that we follow the behavior of our models. And if you're a teacher, model yourself as a reader. That one of the keys is, they say, is be seen reading. If you're in, just sit in class as they're walking in, and you're reading a book, not a textbook, a real book. You're showing them that you enjoy reading. And you might even say, oh, just 1 second, I'm going to finish this page. And then you can even say after it, model discussing the book. You can say to them, oh, this was really interesting in this book, I just discovered this. Or ask them a question about something you read in that book. Maybe you want to suggest this book to someone and say, hey, this is a really interesting book, you might want to read this. But by being a model reader, you're going to encourage them to want to read. Thank you for watching this small talk on extensive reading and motivating your students to want to read when they leave the classroom. Check out the framework again. I've put a PDF at the bottom of this video, and it's on our Macmillan Education Asia website. Look at the framework and try out a few things in your class today, tomorrow. Try out just doing some prediction tasks, maybe just asking some questions. Try setting some context. And make sure your students are aware of the framework, because the more they understand their own learning process, the more they can take control of that learning process. Also, check out our ELT Upgraders podcast with the episode on extensive reading and try to get some more ideas from that. It goes a little bit deeper into some of the theory behind it. Have a good day and see you all next time.